Good afternoon to everyone with us gathered at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, as well as the online audience behind the screens. On behalf of the St. John Paul II Institute of Culture, I am delighted to welcome you all to today's conference. The focus of our conference is the thoughts of Paweł Włodkowic, with a special focus on three of its elements: the concept of just war, sovereignty of nations, and religious freedom throughout the centuries, as well as today. The conference is possible thanks to the generous support of donors and friends of the Angelicum and of the St. John Paul II Institute of Culture, whom I would like to cordially thank. Today's conference will be opened by a few words from Father Thomas Joseph White, the rector of the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas. We will then listen to an introductory lecture by Professor Paul Knoll, followed by the panel discussion with Professor Katrin Droste and Professor Wojciech Fałkowski, moderated by Tomasz Herbich. After a short coffee break, we'll invite our audience to a lecture by Professor Marek Cichocki and a panel discussion with John Lord Alderdice and George Weigel, moderated by Michał Kłosowski. Now, I'd like to give the floor to the Professor Dariusz Karłowicz, Program Director of the St. John Paul II Institute of Culture.
I was not fishing for applause. Dear friend, I would like to most warmly greet all of you here in Aula Minor at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas at a conference organized by St. John Paul II Institute of Culture to inaugurate the new academic year of 2024-2025. Today, the 22nd of October, is the feast of St. John Paul II, a significant day for us as the community of the Angelicum and the St. John Paul II Institute of Culture. We choose this very day to following John Paul's call and come back to the wisdom of the old teacher, Paweł Włodkowic, a 15th century lawyer, diplomat, rector of the University of Krakow, a participant of the Council of Constance, and one of the greatest minds of the Pope's motherland. Włodkowic's writing will today be a starting point for us to discuss concept of religious freedom, just war, and sovereignty of nations in a historical and contemporary context. This kind of discussion seems to be of great importance even for duty in face of the ongoing rapid cultural transformation, often resulting in various limitations of religious freedom, recent political developments, war, conflicts, and aggression against sovereign nations happening on many stages of the globe as we speak. I would like to welcome all of today's speakers who were kind enough to spend this day with us. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a round of applause to Professor Paul Knoll. From the University of Southern California, the author of the introduction to the English language edition of selected writings by Paweł Włodkowic, published by the John Paul II Institute of Culture in 2023. Professor, thank you for joining us. I would like to introduce Professor Katrinę Droste from the Angelicum's Faculty of Theology, a distinguished expert in, among others, medieval theology. Thank you, Sister Professor, very much. I'd like to introduce to you Professor Wojciech Fałkowski. A medieval historian from the Faculty of History of the University of Warsaw. For 7 years, Professor was the head of the Royal Castle in Warsaw Museum. Professor, we are honored to have you with us. I'd like to say a word about my very close friend and person with whom we start and we run the Circle of Political Theology in Warsaw, Professor Marek Cichocki. From Collegium Civitas in Warsaw, the initiator of the research project on Paweł Włodkowic realized by the St. Nicholas Foundation and the true guiding spirit of our conference. It's a pleasure to welcome you at the Angelicum again, Professor Cichocki. John Lord Allardyce, a member of the House of Lords, is one of our honorable guests. Please welcome him very much. Professor Allardyce, a senior research fellow at Harris Manchester College, Oxford. Lord Allardyce has a rich political and peacemaking experience and played a significant role in the talks of Northern Ireland, including negotiation of 1998 Good Friday Agreement. Welcome, John, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you here. And last but not least, Professor George Weigel. Distinguished Senior Fellow Chair in Catholic Studies at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, one of the, as everyone knows, most prominent Catholic authors and commentators. It is wonderful to have you with us, Professor Weigel. Now please let me warmly welcome Father Professor Tomasz Joseph White, the Rector Magnificus of the Angelicum and Professor of Theology, who will give us a few starting remarks introducing us to the reflection ahead of us. The floor is yours.
Thank you. It's so great to have you all here today. We're honored and happy to have the colloquium taking place under the auspices of the John Paul II Institute for Culture, and I'd like to thank all of the staff and Dariusz and others, Father Cezary, for all their organizational work. I have a few opening remarks. The casuistry of modern decision-making regarding just and unjust practices in warfare and conflicts between states is ever-expanding in complexity. New technological capabilities, such as drones and satellite surveillance, render possible new and highly ethically contested forms of warfare. Modern state-sponsored terrorism and independent anti-state terrorism evoke a whole new range of reflections about combat and human ethical intent. Of course, ever since the advent of the atomic age, warfare also has become potentially so devastating to human society as to render many options intrinsically unjust. But just because something is unthinkable does not mean it will not happen, as the 20th century attests, and as the 21st century risks to reiterate or, God forbid, even expand. The Church cannot merely stand on the sidelines of constructive ethical reasoning, perhaps armored by a seemingly coherent pacifist stance, in a world where lethal force continues inevitably to be exerted. A society that reasons ethically about life-taking without the church's influence will only be a more deadly and unethical society. Coherent reflection on the protection of innocent life from conception to natural death is the necessary and logical context in which the church confronts the ethical use of force for the very protection of innocent life, whether by legitimately appointed civil authorities or responsible military powers. And thus, the deontology around casuistry of warfare becomes a necessity, and one that must be ever more precise and restraining. Likewise, deterrence is often the greatest advantage for procuring prolonged resolutions of peace between powers and nations, as is diplomacy and advocacy for other forms of interaction that are constructive rather than destructive. At the same time, questions of war and ethics are inevitably related to two other key topics: national sovereignty and its parameters and limits, and just religious freedom. In an age of religious pluralism related often to nationalistic ideologies or ideologies of nation-states related to religious ambitions, associated also sometimes with various terroristic methods of war, either those conducted by states or by groups against states, all of these questions grow acute and are deeply interrelated. So it's time that we put aside the indulgent and inaccurate ideological fad which deems religious freedom a topic unoriginal to or alien to Catholic intellectual thinking. This idea is neither historically accurate or theologically traditional. The Church has seen fit always to affirm both a doctrine of religious freedom that is robust and a notion of religious accountability in Catholic cultures and communities. And these two ideas, in fact, fit together, whatever the prudential applications may have been in various historical conditions, many of which have been both prudent and just, and some of which have been unjust and imprudent. Today, our symposium considers an early modern locus of reflection on religious freedom and just national sovereignty, war and peace, as issued from the 15th century Polish Catholic figure Paweł Włodkowic. We could couple his reflections with later writings that speak also to other contexts, like Francisco de Victoria from the 16th century in Salamanca, or Catholic cantons of 16th century Switzerland who advocated for religious national sovereignty or local sovereignty and religious freedom. I think also naturally myself of the 17th century founders of the colony of Maryland, who were robust advocates of religious freedom in the United States context, or of Leo XIII, or the authors of Dignitatis Humanae. Catholic priests, religious, bishops, and laity have not only a right, but a responsibility incumbent upon them to express a Catholic ethical position today on these matters in a global and divided context. We should work together as one another as Catholics, but also, of course, with non-Catholics, secular and religious, to foster a multipolar society of justice, peace, charity, and friendship, forgiveness, and reconciliation. For all of this, the truth is necessary, and it is the truth we seek today. May our reflections contribute toward that end, and may St. John Paul the Great pray for us. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Father Rector. Now let me kindly welcome our next speaker, Professor Paul Knoll. Professor Knoll's two primary research focuses are the medieval and Renaissance periods in European history, and the history and civilization of the Western slaves and of the Hungarians in these periods. He has dedicated much of his time to exploring the political and intellectual history, especially the history of universities, with specific attention given to the medieval and Renaissance University of Krakow. Today, Professor Knoll will give a lecture entitled Paweł Włodkowic, Life, context, accomplishment, and the discovery. Professor Knoll, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Thank you very much for being here, and thank you for participating along with us in this process today. It is a pleasure to be part of this. For many present today here, discovering Paweł Włodkowic is not a problem. This is because some of you come from the region where Paweł's life was primarily lived. Others may have prior knowledge of his area and his era of the late Middle Ages. Thus, the question arises why this word discovery figures in the title of this paper and that I begin with it. It is there because the categories noted above, for the most part, despite them, relatively few persons have knowledge of Paweł's world, his biography, the context of his writings, and the reasons why his accomplishments warrant the attentions paid to him today and in the recent book devoted to some of his writings. During the years before my doctoral studies began, I was one for whom the discovery of Paweł lay hidden and shrouded in my future. So I begin this presentation by briefly tracing my path to a discovery of Paweł, who has become a significant and enduring part of my scholarly career. In my first year of doctoral study, I was assigned a seminar topic on the imperial ideals of Emperor Otto III. I had only taken one course in history while studying for the bachelor's degree, but in it, I had written a paper on Gerbert of Aurillac, the eventual Pope Sylvester II, who was the tutor of the youthful Otto, eventually Otto III. Having done so, I was convinced in my youthful hubris that I, therefore, also knew a great deal about Emperor Otto. When my professor and eventual Doktorvater read my paper, his comment was that I had treated only Gallia, Germania, and Roma, but that there was nothing in it about Sclavinia. He told me I needed to read works by such scholars as Labuda, Włodymiański, and Gestor. Anxious to please him, I rushed to the library only to return half an hour later, totally abashed, telling my professor that these books were written in a language I could not read. With a knowing smile, he told me they were in Polish and that I should learn it. At that moment, my future opened before me. Medieval East Central Europe, particularly Poland, would be my scholarly concentration. Not long after, as I found my focus in matters of the 14th and 15th century, the political, cultural, and intellectual figures of that era became my daily companions. My 1968 article on the foundation of the University of Kraków and my 1972 book on King Kazimierz III introduced me to Poland's relations with its neighbors, especially the Knights of the Teutonic Order, and to the beginnings of the history of the University of Kraków. Its personnel and larger history have since then been a continuing subject of my scholarship. By the early 1980s, I myself had, as it were, discovered Paweł Włodkowic. Thus, when I was approached by the Fundacja Świętego Mikołaja and Teologia Polityczna in Warsaw about participating in the project dealing with the translated works of Paweł Włodkowic, I was happy to provide annotation and an introduction to the volume. Paweł was born about 1370, most probably in the district of Dobszyn in Mazovia. His social status and his evident abilities enabled him to pursue an academic education and he eventually enrolled in the arts faculty at the University of Prague, founded by Bohemian King and Holy Roman Emperor-elect Charles IV in 1347-48. Paweł finished his arts course and continued in the Faculty of Canon Law, where he achieved the bachelor's degree in 1396. Soon thereafter, he returned to Poland and as a cleric was first appointed as scholasticus in Poznań and then canon in Płock. He was subsequently encouraged to pursue further legal studies in Italy, probably by Piotr Wiś, Bishop of Kraków, who had studied law in Padua. By 1408, Paweł had earned the license in canon law in Padua, and after that he remained for a time in Italy, becoming active in diplomatic affairs on behalf of the Polish monarchy. Upon his return to Poland in 1411, the dean of the canon law faculty at the University of Kraków, Stanisław Skarbimierz, recommended him for the degree Doctor of Canon Law, noting that Paweł demonstrated a mastery of the law and was also knowledgeable about secular matters. His service, Stanisław argued, for the improvement of the state also qualified him for this degree. His dual qualities as both a scholar and a skilled negotiator and an articulate defender of royal and national interests were soon recognized. Paweł's status as an academic made him part of one of the most important institutions created in the Middle Ages, an achievement that belies the designation of that period as the Dark Ages. This was the Studium Generale, the university. It was original to Europe and distinct from the range of higher learning available previously from antiquity and elsewhere outside of Europe. Paris and Bologna had developed earliest, and others soon followed. Universities preserved, created, and disseminated knowledge in a continuous and systematic fashion. They did not, however, exist as a stereotypical ivory tower. Much of their activity was directly practical and was oriented to such professions as teaching, law, and the array of administrative activities that characterize the ever more sophisticated political, religious, economic, and social institutions of Europe. There was an immediacy about university activity that impinged upon both fundamental doctrinal matters as well as upon political issues affecting the whole of Christian society, both religious and secular. Thus, the skills of the university learned were practical as well as theoretical. They served the administrative needs of the Latin Church, but they were also attractive to secular rulers who made good use of them in their administrations and in their political interests. These university learned were thus often closely engaged in politics. Not until the 14th century, however, with the establishment of Prague, were there university institutions in East Central Europe. King Kazimierz III of Poland followed Charles IV's example and in 1364 obtained permission from the Pope to establish a university in Kraków, expecting in part that individuals trained there in law would be useful in civil administration. His foundation did not prosper, however, sinking into decrepitude following his death in 1370. Efforts to revive the institution in the 1390s were not completely successful, but in 1400, a new Polish king, Władysław Jagiełło, effected a restoration of the studium. This goal had been vigorously sought by both him and his wife Jadwiga of Anjou, who had died the previous year in 1399. Like Kazimierz before him, Jagiełło expected that, in effect, as I have put it elsewhere, the university and its personnel would be useful to him, to the kingdom, and to the larger society by its learning and service. After a difficult first decade, the re-established university began to flourish. Following the receipt of his doctoral degree in law, Paweł began to teach at the studium, and in 1414, he was elected rector of the university. In that same year, he was named a member of a Polish delegation to the Council of Constance, led officially by the Archbishop of Gniezno, but de facto headed by Paweł, who represented the interests and policies of the King of Poland. The Council of Constance, 1414 to 1418, was the largest ecclesiastical assembly in the Middle Ages, and at the same time the greatest of all medieval representative assemblies. Its main purpose was threefold. First, to end the Great Western Schism. Second, to rid the Church of such heresies as Wycliffe and Huss. And third, to reform the Church in capite et membris. But there were other issues taken up at the council, one of which was the political and military conflict between the Knights of the Teutonic Order and Poland, an ongoing hostility that had convulsed northeastern Europe for several generations. The Teutonic Knights were a military religious crusading order established in the Levant in the 12th century. When Christian forces were expelled from the Holy Land, the order reestablished itself in Europe. Upon the invitation of the Polish Duke of Mazovia in 1226, under terms and conditions that have been controversial to this day, they were given possessions in Chełmno, Kulmerland, to defend Christian territory and to campaign against the pagan Prussians. By the end of the 13th century, they had successfully conquered and converted to Christianity these Prussian lands. By the beginning of the 14th century, their expansion, which included their conquest of the territories of Gdańsk, Pomerania, and the lands where Paweł Włodkowic was eventually born, brought them into conflict with Poland. War and diplomatic challenges between Poland and the Teutonic Order were temporarily ended by a peace treaty in 1343. Thereafter, the order concentrated upon efforts to conquer and Christianize pagan Lithuania. Conflict between them was intense and violent. Later in the 14th century, Jogaila, the pagan Grand Duke of Lithuania, converted to Catholic Christianity, taking the Christian name Władysław, but was known also as Jagiełło, the Polonized version of his Lithuanian name. He had then married Jadwiga, already the ruler of Poland, and himself become king of Poland. The issues of Polish Teutonic Order conflict were thus combined with the aggressive pursuit of conquest and conversion of Lithuania by the order. The Teutonic Knights ignored Jagiełło's conversion, claiming that it was a sham, that he and the Lithuanians were still pagan, and that nothing had changed about the validity and necessity of the order's mission. Early in the 15th century, relations worsened between the Teutonic Knights and Jagiełło, along with his cousin Vytautas, who had become Grand Duke. War broke out in 1409, and the combined forces of Poland-Lithuania included pagan Tatar troops and other forces that were not Catholic Christians. The implication of these latter considerations were eventually addressed by Paweł in his writings. In the conflict from 1409 to 1411, known in Polish historiography as the Great War, the crucial battle was in 1410 at Grunwald, a location known by the Lithuanians as Žalgiris and termed by the order with reference to a second nearby location as Tannenberg. Arguably the largest military confrontation in medieval history, the Polish-Lithuanians triumphed decisively, and many of the leading commanders of the order were killed, including the Grand Master. But despite this crushing defeat of the order, Jagiełło failed to pursue his advantage, and the war was eventually ended with a compromise agreement, the first peace of Torun in 1411. Unable to achieve a satisfactory victory against the Teutonic Order, Jagiełło and his advisors resolved to take the conflict before the assembled body of Christendom at the Council of Constance. It was there that Paweł Włodkowic was able by his writings to support Polish royal policy. He did this, however, in a way that transcended a national program. His treatises and arguments raised his contributions into the realm of theory. His views touched upon such issues, among others, as what powers rulers, both ecclesiastical and secular, possessed, upon the problem of war and peace between nations and peoples, upon the theory of what constituted a just war, upon the concept of natural law and the law of nations or peoples, jus gentium, and upon problems of national identity and sovereignty. Let me briefly describe what he wrote at Constance and in the years thereafter, thus including the items in the translated volume of his writings, then turn to the significance of his accomplishments and the implications of his views about larger issues that are not limited to region and time. These confirm the conclusion drawn by Professor Eva Thompson of Rice University in her foreword to the volume Paweł Włodkowic Writings 1416-1432, that his treatises remain worth reading for the 21st century. In 1416, Paweł wrote and distributed to the German nation at Constance a treatise entitled by the first word of its Latin text, Sevientibus. In it, he analyzed the validity and effectiveness of the papal and imperial grants and privileges upon which the order justified itself in its actions. 11 of his points treated papal powers. Another 11 addressed imperial powers. His conclusion, argued impressively with reference to canon law, the Bible, and historical evidence, was that none of the letters and decrees issued to the order by popes or emperors authorizing them to conquer, convert, wage war, or hold conquered territories were valid. These grants and letters contravene natural law and, by extension, the rights of peoples or nationes, the jus gentium. Having done this, Paweł returned to a related subject, one much debated in the Middle Ages, that of whether pagans and infidels have any natural rights. In the 13th century, the influential canonist Henry of Segusio, known in Latin as Ostiensis or Hostiensis, had argued that whatever natural rights non-Christians had held before the birth of Christ, jurisdictions, principalities, dominions, these were lost at the moment Christ was born. Therefore, no longer possessing natural rights, they had no status in law. Moreover, Hostiensis argued, whatever they had previously possessed had been given to the Christian faithful in order that they should be subject to Christians. A somewhat different position was taken in that same century by Pope Innocent IV, Sinibaldo de Fieschi, himself a distinguished canon and civil lawyer. Pope Innocent IV argued that in natural law, the dominions and rights of pagans and infidels were not taken away at Christ's birth, and that these were retained until they were later taken away by ecclesiastical and civil laws. His position was later generally affirmed by Thomas Aquinas. In contrast to both of these positions, what Paweł Włodkowic argued was that ecclesiastical and secular law were inferior to natural and divine law, and that Hostiensis' and others' teachings was and remained wrong. Therefore, all the claims to legitimacy of the Teutonic Order's conquests were invalid. Shortly thereafterward, Paweł distributed another treatise entitled Opinio Hostiensis to all the nations at the council. In its 52 articles, he made many of the same arguments that had been presented in Sevientibus and called upon the council to remove the error that had resulted from accepting Hostiensis' position, meaning that the order had no legal rights to what they claimed and that they should be suppressed. This argument was taken up again in Paweł's Ad Aperiendam, a treatise not included in the published writings 1416 to 36. In it, Paweł argued that the Teutonic Order was a secta Prussiana, a pestiferous Prussian sect, that its character was heretical, and that like other heresies, implicitly he was equating the order to the heresies of Wycliffe and Huss, it should be destroyed. A fourth treatise, Articuli, that Paweł Włodkowic wrote and distributed at Constance was one identified in the 20th century by Stanislaus Belch. It was a systematic set of 155 items in which Paweł listed the order's crimes against pagans, its illegal conquests, and its destructive actions against property and inhumane actions against persons. These charges contain detailed historical evidence and constitute a telling legal indictment. Indeed, this is how Paweł described himself in this work. He claimed to be neither a scholar nor a royal ambassador. He was, quote, an instigator, promoter, and procurator deputized by this sacred council, end quote. As such, the articles became a legal indictment. For Paweł, justice, order, and peace had been damaged by the order, which he again termed a heresy, saying that, quote, all of this is public and notorious truth, end quote. From this, he concluded it follows that the order should be suppressed. Paweł's critiques evoked defensive responses from the order, to which he responded in the treatises Iste Tractatus and Quoniam Error. The first of these addressed the scurrilous charges made by Johannes Falkenberg, a German Dominican who had previously been a member of the Krakow Dominican Studium. In a work that Professor Eva Thompson has discussed very well in her foreword to the Writings 1416 to 32 volume, Falkenberg had charged that Jagiełło was a pagan idol, that the Poles worshipped him, that he and they were heretics and shameless pagan dogs, and that the best services Christendom could render would be to kill Poles and their king. In Iste Tractatus, Paweł coolly and systematically demonstrated the invalidity of papal and imperial powers vis-a-vis the claims made by the order, then turned directly to his analysis of the Satira, concluding that the only thing Falkenberg had really tried to do was to argue that Poles, even more than pagans, deserved to be exterminated. Some modern scholars have seen Falkenberg's position as calling for a genocide before the name. Paweł and the Polish delegation demanded that Falkenberg be condemned and punished by the council, but the matter dragged on to a compromise conclusion in 1424. In his second treatise, Quoniam Error, Paweł took up the anti-Polish charges by Johannes von Urbach of Bamberg, whose work had been paid for by the order with funds provided by their general procurator. Von Urbach's treatise was clearly aggressive in its critique of Paweł's writings, but it was in many ways less polemical and better argued in its structural approach of systematically addressing key points in Paweł's arguments and defending what he, von Urbach, understood as valid century-old interpretations of canon and civil law. Paweł's response, challenging von Urbach's conclusions, revealed again his impressive mastery of canon law and of the writings of past and present scholars, including some present at Constance who stood in high regard among their contemporaries. After the Council of Constance, Paweł continued to be active in defending Polish royal policies. In the other compositions contained in writings 14, 16, 32, he further developed the positions, both political and theoretical, argued in his previous treatises. Some of these works, particularly the letter to Bishop Zbigniew Olesznicki of Kraków in 1432, that has become known in Polish historiography as Paweł's last word, reflect not only his scholarship, his support of Polish policy, and hostility to the Teutonic Order, but also an adherence to the ideals he had previously articulated, and reflects also a personal and deeply felt affiliation to what he called his fatherland, the territories of Dobszyn and the, quote, peaceful kingdom of Poland, end quote. He died probably in 1436 and was buried in Wawel Cathedral in Kraków. In what follows, I want to say just a few things about the themes Paweł developed in his writings and to assess briefly the significance of his achievement. It will be these considerations that I expect will enliven the conference discussions to come, rather than his biography and the details of diplomacy and politics, important as they are, especially since they provide a fuller understanding of the nature and character of the medieval history of East Central Europe and its modern ramifications. Central to Paweł's views was his concept of natural law and the implications he drew from this. Natural law was superior to any enacted law and could not be abolished or modified by human action, whether ecclesiastical or secular. Unlike the concept of natural law held in antiquity, which made it something that was merely ontologically part of the warp and weft of the universe, natural law was for Paweł of divine origin, just as was the law that had been divinely revealed in the Bible. Natural law was guaranteed for all humanity, and here Paweł reflected the views of his contemporary and university colleague, Stanisław of Skarbimierz, who had remarked in an early 1410 sermon on the just war that, quote, natural law was likewise something that existed for all persons, end quote. For Paweł, since God had created humanity, it followed that natural law could not therefore be revoked or contravened. It guaranteed certain rights to everyone. In this, Paweł extended his broad conformity with the tradition of natural law in the medieval period. From natural law, Paweł derived the law of nations. Although God gave humanity dominion over the earth and, in the beginning, usage was held in common, eventually it became clear that some peoples possessed some things and others other things. By the law of nations, dominions were distinguished and kingdoms divided, Paweł concluded, therefore, that infidels and pagans may justifiably and legally have possessions and dominions just as Christians. This is a right that is immutable. The law of nations defended inviolable rights and established norms of justice that are evident to human reason. In the treatises printed in writings 1416 to 32, Paweł spelled out the implication of these conclusions, especially as they related to the powers of spiritual and temporal authorities. Indeed, much of what he wrote is related to power and its exercise. It can never be arbitrary and unjust. Both implicitly and explicitly, he relied upon the principles of the just war, but these he modified in subtle but significant ways by saying that a potentially just war must be inquired into and be declared to be legitimate. Here in embryo, Paweł was, in the interpretation of some modern scholars, envisioning an international or supranational tribunal presided over by an individual whose great moral and ethical authority would rise above local, national, and even religious constraints and be recognized by all. This is most clearly expressed in his last word, the letter to Bishop Olesnicki in 1432, which recommended the middle way of adjudication to resolve conflicts. Natural law, the law of nations, and potentially a tribunal rooted in these traditions. These become, in reflection, some of the greatest potentialities of Paweł's thought. He emerges in this context as a star member of what many have called with considerable justification a school of international law in 15th century Kraków. It included consideration of the rights not only of those groups and individuals that were part of the community of Christendom, but also of those who lay outside it. In its most fundamental form, these are all questions of ethics, and Polish views on these matters with respect to Paweł have seldom been presented more cogently than in the modern analysis provided by Stefan Świeżawski in his survey of these matters. The implications of all of this are of a high order to consider for this discussion. But let me propose here just one example. What if Paweł's views had won the day? In early modern Europe, rather than the tradition of Hostienses, despite the memorable entreaties of Bartolomeo de las Casas in the 16th century that resonated with views similar to those of Paweł's, it was Hostienses' positions, consciously or unconsciously, that lay at the heart of the European policy of colonialism and perhaps even the spirit of manifest destiny that was later used to justify American continental expansion. Today's world might have turned out significantly differently. Why it did not, and why Paweł's views were largely unknown and unappreciated by later generations, is a difficult story to understand. It may or may not be a theme that will be much discussed in this conference, but it is still worth more analysis than I was able to give it in the conclusion of my introduction to the volume Paweł Włodkowic, Writings 1416 to 1432. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Knoll, for this wonderful lecture. Now I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Tomasz Herbich, who will be the moderator of the panel discussion that follows the lecture we have just listened to. Tomasz Herbich is a doctor of philosophy, also graduated in theology and political science. He lectures at the University of Warsaw. He is editor-in-chief of the Yearbook of the History of Polish Philosophy, as well as member of the editorial board of Political Theology. He specializes in the history of Polish and Russian philosophy, philosophy of politics and philosophy of religion, as well as biblical theology. Tomasz Herbich will share more about our special guest in the panel. Dr. Herbich and guest, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much for introducing myself, and I'm now going to invite and briefly introduce the participants of this panel, which we are just going to hear now. It is going to consist of two parts. In the first part, I'm going to moderate the discussion and to ask some questions to our participants. And during the second part, you all, the participants of our conference, will have a possibility to ask your questions and I think also to get answers to these questions. First of all, of course, I would like to invite Professor Paul Knoll. Please, Professor Paul Knoll, take a seat because we are going to discuss from this place. And also after that, of course, all these participants were briefly introduced by Dariusz Karłowicz, but I'm just going to remind you of these introductory remarks. I would like to invite Professor Wojciech Fałkowski, who is the historian who specializes in the history of Middle Ages, a professor at the University of Warsaw, and who was from 2017 to 2024 the director of the King's Castle in Warsaw. And I would also like to invite Sister Professor Catherine Droste. The sister is the professor of theology at this university, of course, at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, Angelicum. Since 2011, she has served as a professor of theology, as well as vice dean and dean of the Faculty of Theology. She specializes in moral theology, and her lectures include such topics as cardinal virtues and their practical bearing on the Christian life, justice in relation to other virtues, and also sister is a member of the Dominican Sisters of the Congregation of Saint Cecilia. And now, thank you very much, and I would like to start with the first question. During our panel discussion, we are going to make two important things. First of all, to further reconstruct certain key aspects of Włodkowic's thought, and after that also we will attempt to show their current relevance. And I would like to start with the question directed to Professor Paul Knoll, and I would like to begin by asking about the relationship between the pragmatic and concrete aspects on the one side and the theoretical and more general aspects on the other side in the writings of Paweł Włodkowic. It seems that the balancing between these two orders, the concrete specific case and the broader theoretical reflection, which makes it possible to grasp the specifics of this concrete case and evaluate it, is characteristic of the genre of reflection that Włodkowic cultivated, for which the key point of reference are the problems of canon law. So how does this genre of reflection, this concrete genre of reflection, the canon law, affect the nature of Włodkowic's writings, as well as their accessibility to modern readers?
Thank you very much for posing that question, because the whole process of achieving this volume made me rethink a number of elements that have been raised here by the parts of this various question. I think one of the aspects of Paweł Włodkowic's genius was that he was comfortable being both a pragmatist and a theorist. He clearly believed in the policies that he was supporting on behalf of the monarchy, and had almost a visceral feeling with respect to the justice that was being sought by the monarchy. And in that sense, this concrete and pragmatic approach was something that he achieved at a very high level. At the same time, he was able to rise above that, as I mentioned in the comments that I was making. These were not just simply isolated individual issues of specific topics in political matters. Instead, they were bits and pieces of higher theoretical issues, and it was these theoretical issues that deserved just as much attention and just as much devotion of his intellectual power as his mastery of the details of policy. So that I think he was able to rise above the pragmatic to deal with specific and general matters in this theoretical, and not just simply to take a received theoretical tradition. I think one of the things which is sometimes said about medieval thought was that, well, there was no originality to it because the idea was simply to repeat and reaffirm what had been said prior. But the realities of medieval thought were such that the situation and the concrete issues being dealt with changed, and so therefore the theoretical and the abstract issues had to respond to these new things. And this is the way in which considerable progress was made in the medieval period. You've unfortunately tapped into a historian who's likely to say, well, what do we have for the next 4 days to do but listen to me? So we will not do that. But let me comment about the other aspect of your question, which clearly is a problem for readers of this text, because Paulus Vladimiri Paweł Włodkowic is arguing as a lawyer. This is what he trained to be. And in training, he masters an incredible body of information, which he refers to just because he has it literally memorized, and refers to it in passing in the text of his writings in such a way that the casual reader might find himself or herself lost in whatever it is that is being argued, because, well, what does this particular reference mean? What does that particular reference mean? And this is a little difficult. That having been said, because canon law itself was based in concrete answers to real problems in the history of the church, this enables readers to sort of tread lightly over these annotations, these references to canon law. They're almost like modern-day footnotes, to tread lightly on the footnotes and see the basis upon which some of the actual developments and the larger implications rest. And so I hope that readers of the translated version of Paweł's writings will not be put off by references to various aspects of medieval canon law that they have no knowledge of, but recognize the larger significance of this. And I think the readers will find much reward in this respect.
Thank you very much.
Here.
I think that it will be better. So thank you very much for your answer. We can now see how the theory and these theoretical achievements of Paweł Włodkowic developed in concrete situations and in dealing with concrete matters, yes, of course. And now I would like to ask the second question to Professor Wojciech Fałkowski, which is somehow connected with this first question, because we can see, of course, Paweł Włodkowic not only as balancing between these two orders, the order of the pragmatic, concrete aspects on the one side and the theoretical and general thought on the other side, but we can see him also as located at the intersection of the political order on the one side and the ecclesiastical order on the other side. Włodkowic on the one side represents the specific, particular position of a particular side of the political dispute, but at the same time his achievements are of universal significance, representing a significant achievement in the history of philosophy and political legal thought. So how then should we view Włodkowic? As primarily a representative of the Polish interests, or perhaps as someone who speaks out in the dispute over universal, primordial issues, as for example just mentioned in the last part of the lecture conducted by Professor Knoll de las Casas later did?
Well, my first reaction on the question is to answer end of this remark. Obviously, he was a representative of Polish king. Certainly, he was sent to Constance as a representative to achieve two goals. One, to deny false accusation of Jagiełło, Polish king, that he was false Christian, and that Jagiełło, Polish king, represented in fact pagans and defended them. Certainly he had to, confirm the fruits of victory in Tannenberg. The situation 4, 5, 6 years after this battle was certainly was uncertain, was really under discussion. What should be the effect of this battle? Victory was evident, but what is the achievement? What is the result of this war? And he was sent to defend Polish interest and position, especially personal position of Polish king as a good and true Christian. These accusations by Falkenberg were really serious. That when he formulated thesis that in fact Poland is a pagan territory and Polish king is in fact false, non-true Christian, was partly accepted by public opinion, and he had to defend this and to fight with these accusations. The second remark concerned two orders, political and ecclesiastical. Well, Falkenberg, I start with the first remark, with the first answer. Falkenberg told and announced publicly that the real possessor of lands, all lands in the world, is Pope. So, on name of the church, one can fight with pagans and conquer the land. This was, in fact, in service of Teutonic order, and was a thesis which had to be perceived as a defense of them. And this theory of two swords. Theory of two swords, that there is one sword in hand of Pope, the second in hands of Emperor. This theory was founded on thesis that the first power, the main power, is given by God, and obviously Pope is the main person in the world. So Paweł couldn't say that Pope has no right to for some lands, but he used, and this is perhaps a separate field of our discussion, but I mentioned this, used a very good argument. He formulated, and Professor Knoll was right to underline that the profession of Paweł Włodkowic. He was a lawyer, but he could jump outside of his field of competence. And he used a moral argumentation. He said that the war must have moral justification, not legal, not political one, not matter of honor, but moral. And this was invention on big scale. It was an invention of Krakow School of Philosophy, together with Stanisław from Skarbimierz. And he used this argument to say that only moral argumentation or only moral justification can decide upon the war and goals people want to achieve. And there is also one thing perhaps quite difficult to say briefly. Teutonic Order was a coercion state. This was a state founded on coercion. They organized whole state, whole organism structure of it on coercion, and they used this coercion to invade, to conquer pagan, let's say, Lithuanian and Polish lands. And if we use moral argumentation, this is exactly what we should do against this argumentation, against these words. And in this spectrum, we see this, what he said about jus gentium, natural law, and rights of nations. And his words were very simple, very prompt, that every nation, every tribe has right to have possession of his land. And all wars against them is against natural law and against, I would like to underline, moral argumentation, moral justification of war. Thank you very much. And as we are now turning to some moral issues, we should of course turn to Sister Professor. And I would like to ask you about this, one of the main aspects of the theory which can be derived from the writings of Paweł Włodkowic, of course, about his, I would like to ask you about his teachings on natural law. Of course, according to Włodkowic, as we have just heard, natural law is given by God just as the law that was revealed in the Bible. Of course, from this natural law, Włodkowic derives the law of nations, jus gentium. And according to this natural law, he is also critically targeting the practice of conversion that was carried out by the Teutonic Order. So now please let me ask you, what aspects of this Włodkowic's teachings on natural law
especially the law of peoples, the law of nations, preserve relevance for contemporary reflection in ethics or moral theology.
Thank you, Tomasz. And also I'd like to thank Professor Knoll. Your introduction to the whole work is excellent, as well as your talk today. Thank you. Also, as Professor Knoll already noted, the strength of Paweł's argument based in natural law. So I would like to just make reference back to that, which is, again, for Paweł, not some nebulous natural law, but it is founded in divine law. And then you have divine law, natural law, and then the jus gentium, the law of the people. And Paweł that's very clear in all of Paweł's writings, so I would just make note of that. As to the specifics, what is important for us today and what is relevant today? Well, I think we can just start with a principle that Paweł first references, that one should not molest those living peaceably. That that we should basically have a peaceful coexistence, whether infidel or believer. Now, with this as a basic, very general foundation, I would note 4 specific teachings that come from, again, they're all rooted in divine law, and we can see some of them are closer to divine law, some of them seem almost of natural law formally, but then also become something of this jus gentium. The first is simply the right to life. That with reference, he references divine law, thou shalt not kill. So therefore, again, peaceful infidels are not to be molested. They can live in peace. He says here, both faithful and infidel without distinction are our neighbors. Again, referencing to the divine law. Love your neighbor as yourself, but bringing it into the concrete reality. Based on this right to life, he also speaks of a right to freedom. Here against Onstian-CC, he argues very strongly against this. He references Augustine in the City of God several times. And he's arguing again here, this right to freedom is that there is an equality of all people. Again, whether Christian or whether infidel. And that the pagan state has a right if they do not attack Christians. So there has to be this mutual tolerance. So a right to life and then a right to my freedom to live. Within that is also what Professor Fałkowski just mentioned, the whole question of right to property. Therefore, if I have this right to live, I have this freedom, I also have a right to my property. Based again in divine law, thou shalt not steal. Again with reference to Augustine, who argues that theft is any illicit taking. And therefore included in this is any taking of any property, anything that belongs to the infidel. The law is interpreted, as I say, in this context of jus gentium, that the infidels as a people, as this individual people, have a right to their possessions. They may possess land. Any unjust seizing of their land or property requires restitution. So then he applies again the whole principle of justice, and which we would develop as to restitution if anything is untaken unjustly. An interesting argument that he uses here when he's arguing for the right to property, I just found it rather interesting. He goes back to ecclesial law and he says, even the law of the church allows Christians to marry infidels and they do not have to convert. Well, that's as to marriage, but his argument is, if the Christian can marry the infidel and they can retain their religion, if she tolerates their religion, then it logically follows that the church should tolerate jurisdiction and dominion over material goods. So it's just a little interesting argument that he's using there, kind of pulling this idea of marriage and what the church is already doing as an argument, extending that argument. The fourth principle that I would argue, as I say, right to life, right to freedom, right to property is the right to conscience, which ties in with and basically is very much a foreshadowing of Vatican II, Gaudium et Spes, Dignitas Humanae, religious freedom. This toleration of religion is a recognition of this right to conscience. As he states in Sapientibus, conversion should not be forced. It should be an appeal to conscience. He's recognizing the dignity of all human beings. Christian baptism must be approached freely. This is a teaching that we all uphold. And now he's applying that specifically in this context as to the infidel. Here, there's another interesting little argument that I'd like to reference that he's using as to this right to conscience and religious freedom. He makes a reference to Thomas Aquinas here, and Thomas makes two distinctions. Now, they're related, but also could be extended a great deal in another full argument. It's from the Summa Theologiae, where Thomas is asking the question of whether one owes allegiance to an infidel, to an unbeliever. So that's the context of the argument. And within this discussion, Thomas makes two distinctions. He first says, what belongs to divine right and jus gentium? So he makes a distinction here, and he says, jus gentium, the law of the people, law of society, is about dominion. But he's connecting that here. When you're talking about religion, you've also got jus divinum. So he's saying these two are basically being balanced out in this question of my right to conscience. But Thomas argues that belief and unbelief, which belong to jus divinum, do not annul human rights, do not annul the jus gentium. So these faithful, therefore, it would seem, have something of a right as infidels, according to the divine law, if it's not contradicting. However, Thomas has another distinction. So that's the first one, between jus gentium, dominion, and the question of belief, which is under jus divinum. But then Thomas makes another distinction. And he says that the church's lack of authority is different over those who never had the faith versus those who have lost the faith. So dealing with the infidel, he's making a distinction on who is the infidel. And the point is, the infidel who never had the faith must be respected and has all of those rights, which is different from someone who had the faith and rejected it. He says, why? Because then the church can come in and say, this king has left the faith, and therefore you as his people do not owe him that obedience. Just an interesting point as we go into some of the details of arguments even today as to religion and as to that authority that I think are very important. So my point would be, I think all of these are very relevant today. We can look at wars around the world, and every one of these points comes into play, which he is arguing based on natural law, based in divine law, and then based in the law of the people. Thank you.
So, thank you very much. Sister Professor has just said about the relevance, the current relevance of these teachings on the natural law that were formulated by Paweł Włodkowic more than 600 years ago, not only 500 years ago. And now please let me turn back to Professor Knoll. I would like to ask you about one very important from the medieval thought problem, the problem of the relationship between the papal and imperial powers. Włodkowic, of course, formulated a kind of a solution to this very important historical problem. He recognized the universalism of papal power, just as it was previously said by Professor Fałkowski, but he somehow denied the universalism of secular imperial power. What leads Włodkowic to such a solution in which he subordinated the imperial power to the power of the Pope?
You've got to stop asking these easy questions. Because this is a really hard question, since that is a central issue, one of the central issues involved in the concerns that Paweł Włodkowic had. He's dealing with a tradition in which, at the very beginning, with the development of the Christian Church as an institution, it in many respects owed its potential for growth in the 4th century to imperial power. The conversion of Constantine and the allowance of Christians to worship freely and to establish their own religion freely, in a sense, constituted a precedent for imperial power that continued on into the early medieval period and was, in many respects, ultimately best represented by Charlemagne in the 8th and the 9th century. The idea of the power of the church and the power of responding to imperial power was in many ways a game that was very, very uneven for many generations and many centuries. And it was only after the failure of the Carolingian settlement in the course of the 9th on into the 10th century that the possibility emerged for a different approach toward the understanding of who has power and what kind of power this is and what the relationship between various powers are. And the development of papal claims, especially to universalism in the church, that were first echoed in the way in which Rome claimed primacy over the other great seats of the Christian church in Constantinople or Antioch or Jerusalem or Alexandria, now becomes a set of claims that is expanded beyond just simply the control of the church and the life of the church into the larger society as a whole. And there is a period of time in the 10th and the 11th centuries when these conflicting claims, one made by the imperial tradition, the other derived out of the church, are in substantial conflict. We sort of simplify this when we talk about this as the investiture controversy, because investiture was only one small, well, I shouldn't say one small, it was only one element that was involved in this struggle between imperial power and papal power. But the ultimate resolution that came in that quote-unquote investiture controversy in the edict of, not the edict, but the compact of Worms in 1122, in a sense represents a failure of imperial power and the de facto triumph of papal and religious power. And this particular process continues to grow. Now, what Paulus Vladimiri talks about, however, is that this universalism was subject to divine law and to natural law. It is not just simply that these elements, imperial power or a papal power, are relevant only within contemporary society. This is a universal issue within the framework of divine law and natural law. And I think that this was a distinction that he was able to make in his treatises to define what the limitations of papal and imperial power were. That there are certain kinds of things that are due for the emperor. There are other things that are due for the church. But that overall there is a divine law that encompasses everything in this. So I think this is the process by which he reconciles this, and it plays out in a variety of different contexts. I mean, sometimes it's as petty as what specific right does the Teutonic Order claim to have with respect to this, that, or the other action, or this, that, or the other possession? If they claim that they were given this power and authority by the papacy, then what right did the papacy have to give this power? And here's where Paulus would say, the power of the papacy is not absolute, it is governed by this tradition of divine law and natural law. And divine law and natural law are the ways in which he reconciles imperial and papal rivalries and imperial and papal authority. I think that comes across all of the writings one will find in this set of publications.
Okay, thank you very much. And I would now like to ask Professor Fałkowski about the problem that was somehow mentioned already by Professor Knoll in his lecture. It is, of course, this great phenomenon and the significance of this phenomenon of medieval universities. And of course, I would like to ask you about this problem in this Polish context to which we are now referring, of course, to this context of Krakow Academy. As we know, shortly after establishing Krakow Academy, such great representatives of this academy like Stanisław of Skarbimierz or Paweł Włodkowic became such an influential persons that influenced both, in the case of Paweł Włodkowic, the Council of Constance, or that influenced the intellectual culture of their times and also the political matters, the political issues in their times. How was it possible to come? How did it happen that Polish science in such a short period of time reached such a high level, that it was possible that to influence the European intellectual life by the representatives of this science that was that we can connect with this Krakow Academy?
Yes, well, you said that you had a difficult question. Well, this is probably one of biggest mysteries in the world. For what reason something happens and the genius are, many of them are in one place. Well, in preliminary explanation, I would say about two things. One is the rise of universities in Central Europe. Professor Knoll mentioned in his lecture about this image from time of Otto III with 4 provinces of the world, Gallia, Germania, Roma, and Sclavinia. In this explanation, we must go outside of the limits of the borders of Sclavinia. In Central Europe, using term Central Europe, since foundation of Prague University in 1347, I use the first date of this, until end of 14th century, we have 6 new universities founded in this area. After Prague was Kraków, or immediately after Kraków, Pécs, Vienna, Erfurt, and Heidelberg. It created intellectual space in my eyes. We imagine that we have quite small community of intellectuals in these lands, and counted in hundreds of people, not in thousands. And they knew each other. They changed their universities, their job, their cathedrals, chairs, and chairs, not cathedral. They exchanged ideas, points of view, and in fact, within a half of century, it created space with many of centers where intellectual life arose, was visible with discussions, sometimes very violent, and with some different people who were opposite to ideas of others. At the beginning of 15th century, it was a crisis of Prague University, and since King of Bohemia tried to intervene in the university. In university was created, was founded, was invented perhaps, as a space of free intellectual dispute. And one day, the king wanted to intervene and to say it should be in this direction, in this way, not in other. So many of them, majority of researchers and intellectuals, also with students, went out and created new university in Germany. So perhaps this, at first, this mood, intellectual ferment, and also the crisis of this Prague University helped to the rise of Kraków Academy. The second is completely different. Nature of my explanation will be in other way, in other direction. Within the life of Paweł Włodkowic, there were two elections of the king in first half of his life. Free election of the king means, in fact, that the subject can decide upon the ruler against traditional hierarchy and tradition of heritage. It helps, it provokes, it gives possibility for, let's say, individual liberty, personal freedom. I can decide upon the monarch, I can decide upon my thinking, what I am, and what I do, and what I say, what I teach, what I learn. And this personal space of freedom, in my eyes, contributed very much to the situation that the Kraków Academy arose so quickly and so high. And perhaps the third thing, many intellectuals from Kraków University were in the service of Polish king. Władysław Jagiełło used them as counselors and advisors and people in diplomacy, and they were about 100 people. So the group was quite big, very big even. And if you must be a good advisor, you must have a civic courage. Not only intellectual capabilities, not only your knowledge must be great, but also courage to say what you think really. Mm-hmm. And this helps also, I think, at least, in the debate, or a scientific debate at university. And it is important also now. This is important nowadays.
So thank you very much for pointing out also this specific political Polish context, which made it possible for the Academy of Krakow to develop and to rise in such a good way in this time. Now I have to ask one more difficult question, or maybe two more difficult questions, but of course I have to do it. I have to ask about the just war And of course, please, Sister Professor, answer this question. Of course, Stanisław of Skarbimierz or Paweł Włodkowic, they are usually perceived as people that developed the teaching on just war in a concrete historical context, of course. And I would like now to ask you about the current relevance of their teachings. Should we leave the concept of the just war aside today, or is it worth revisiting? What do you think about it?
Talk about a difficult question. I don't think I can answer this question in completeness, but because it's a complex question that we know has been debated for centuries, millennia, but also just in the last decades and in the last years, and even right now.
Yes,
so
of course.
I can't give a definitive answer, but let me at least base some points on Paweł and on some of the things that he says, and also on his sources. First, though, just as to the context of, just to the point of history, I would just like to make a comment on that, because we attribute the principles of just war initially to something like Augustine, that he first came up with something of these principles. And with Augustine, we can see there was a context. We have the barbarian invasions. We have a more full development. We can talk about Thomas Aquinas. Now, Thomas, of course, is much more speculative, yet his on kingship, some of his arguments are, Thomas is speculative, but the practical is lying behind it, but perhaps not as intensely as with Augustine or with Paweł. Then we have De las Casas, de Vittoria, etc., and so we see the history. But I would like to bring it up to, even in Rerum Novarum, Vatican II, the point is that the Church, just war, is a part of Catholic social teaching, and Catholic social teaching has a historical element, meaning there is some flexibility and some change that will occur. So I would just say we have to take that into context, because that's where we are today, with this whole question of how do we apply, how do these principles apply. And so looking at Paweł's, we can set aside some of his principles, I would say, today, that are not quite as relevant. Example, one of his is that only secular and laity can engage in war. Well, we don't usually argue for that too much today because we have a long history of it. All right. Or I would say there's some variation in terms of authority, because he's arguing in the 14th, 15th century as to the church as the sole authority, and today we would also attribute much more to the state. So there's some variations on his points. But first of all, just to look at what are his principles, which Professor Knoll made reference to, but here I would just like to lay them out, I think, for us to have. He notes these both in his Opinio Ostiensis and as in Sevientibus, that he's referencing Raymond of Capua, Dominican, excuse me, in Bologna, because he's going back to some of his own teachers in Padua, of course. But he's using 5 categories that Raymond of Capua introduced: person, thing, cause, spirit, authority. Person being who can fight, as I say, I'm kind of setting that one aside, although today we could have it more of women and men. That would be the more recent as to who fights, rather as to clerics and laity. The second one is thing. Here it's a question of what are you fighting for? Not necessarily the cause. He says the cause is just different, but what's going on that's the beginning of this war. And his argument here is that you can fight to recover something that has been taken wrongly, or for defense. So it would seem here that he's arguing against something of a purely aggressive war, which we would agree with today and is very relevant today. His third point, as I say, cause. The cause is for peace. Now, this is a very relevant point today that I think we have to keep in mind, and that is being brought up more and more in the church in terms of this whole question of, and also in the world, how does peace come into play? Because that's the end, but it also has to be something of even the beginning.
Yes, of course.
And I think that's much more relevant or much more discussed today, yet Paweł already has that. which again is a great deal of his foreshadowing of our contemporary discussions. And this cause as to peace is also significant in that conversion of pagans and infidels is insufficient argument for a cause, which we've already noted. Fourth one, the spirit. And here I would say he's looking at, what is a virtuous war? He's talking about ad bellum, going into war, but it's also this question of what's going on in bello. With the cause, we could say more of post-bellum. The spirit, a redress with charity, justice, obedience, versus hatred, revenge. And I would say that is all very relevant today. And then, as I already noted, authority, where the authority is the church, or as you had noted, Professor Knoll, the whole question of perhaps this greater body that helps to discern whether that war is just. Now, as we're looking at this, contemporary criteria are what? Well, we often list proper authority, just cause, same thing that he's listed, right intention. Why are we doing it for this peace? The cause is to achieve, not as defense, or as defense or to recover. We also include last resort. So that's something we see a little bit, I would say we can see elements of that in Paweł, but perhaps not as explicit as we have today, but we could pull out some threads. Reasonable chance of success. Again, I think all of these contemporary arguments that we use, we can find threads of, even though they're not explicit in Paweł's writings. But you do see what he is writing, is it definitely this foreshadowing, and is it definitely relevant today? I don't think there's any question of that. Also, the proportion between risk and benefits. Again, these are not explicit in his, but today we would use these as principles that we must address to look at a just war. Now, he does add a sixth criteria, in both of these writings, the Sevientibus and also in his Ostiensis, Contra Ostiensis. He says that a war could fit all of his other criteria, but it also has to be fought it cannot be fought at the wrong time. Now here he's using the whole question of on a feast day. Now we haven't incorporated this at all in our contemporary arguments for just war, and I think you could argue that rightly so. If we're fighting, we can look at Israel and Palestine right now, just because that began in terms of the midst of feast days, et cetera, and we often even internationally, we try to have peace during these times of celebration, especially even religious celebration. But would you argue that if you have a just war, and the combatants still fight perhaps on a Sunday or during Easter, does that negate the entire war? I think there's a problem there. I think we can say it might be sinful to fight on those days, but I don't think we would go to the extent of saying that nullifies everything of the war. And I think that would be perhaps why we don't include that principle. But all of the other principles, I believe, are very relevant for today. We can even see that he actually even includes some of the post-bellum as to restitution, assistance of infidels, which, well, that's within bello as well. So you see that the categories we use today are very relevant and I think very applicable.
Yes, thank you very much. And the last question, before I give you the possibility to ask your questions, if there are any, just please let me know from the audience. But before that, I would like to ask about this final remark of the lecture of Professor Knoll. This is the final remark according to which it was possible for the Europe to go to follow the path of such authors like Włodkowic, for example, and if Europe follows such path, it would not be the case of colonialism and of this colonial politics in later Europe. So my question is, of course, this is a very important remark, which shows, of course, the relevance, the current relevance of this in the context, of course, of our post-colonial Europe, of this thought of Włodkowic. But first of all, I would like to ask, is it possible, by referring to Paweł Włodkowic, to somehow reject not only colonial policies, but also certain elements of the intellectual culture that led to colonialism and against which Włodkowic was, of course, previous to the moment in which these colonial policies arose.
It's a good thing we're limited to only a minimum number of questions. They get harder and harder and harder. Because we're talking about a counterfactual. It's quite clear that Paweł's views were not views that were adopted. In the 16th century, well, in the 15th century, even before, the views of George Podjebrad in Bohemia, who had a schema that he envisioned for world peace. That didn't go anywhere. The ideas of Bartolomé de las Casas were clearly minority views that were overridden by the royal and imperial powers that were pursuing overseas expansion. And one can go forward through other centuries and look at other proposals that were ambitious and well-intended, but which for one reason or another failed. In the 20th century, the aftermath of the First World War was a noble vision of the League of Nations, which proved to be a very weak reed indeed. And it raises the question as to whether or not there is something deeply inbred in us as human beings to resist this kind of aspiration and rather to respond. And some scholars have argued that this has been a very great characteristic long before overseas colonialism of the medieval tradition, that the making of Europe was a making that was done through force, and there was very, very little peaceful about the way in which the Saxons were Christianized by Charlemagne in the 8th and the 9th century. And that this is something that is deeply embedded in our European and, by extension, other territorial expansion. That having been said, just because something doesn't work doesn't mean that it isn't worth aspiring to. And I think in all instances, it has been a manifestation of what could be, what might be, what we should do if we can achieve this. And therefore, even failures in the implementation of any of Paulus Vladimiri's ideas can nevertheless not be disregarded. They are still outposts of hope and potential that I think we ought still to take very seriously at all times. This ideal is kind of like Sisyphus rolling the stone upward. It's striving for success but always falling short, and yet it is worth the effort. It is absolutely worth the effort, because this is where the best of humanity can be seen and inspired by the ideals that motivate the best of humanity. I think this is where we have Paulus and others to speak for us.
Thank you very much. If you, Professor Fałkowski and Sister Professor Droste, have any more additional remarks on this topic, on the topics of the thinking of Włodkowic, which can be against this later path of colonialism, please just share with us these remarks, and after that, of course, I will ask you to answer the questions that you have, that other participants of our conference have.
Two remarks, perhaps not in the center of your question, but I think interesting concerning his thinking. I think that, in my eyes, Włodkowic's thinking was realistic, not idealistic. he treated political and legal issues as a real problems, and he used argumentation, sometimes outside of the knowledge which was obvious at that time, but in the goal he wanted to achieve the goal precisely seen, precisely defined. This is the first remark. The second is that I've got impression, I wonder whether you agree or not, that in his thinking natural law is not opposite to divine law. And in this context, the pagans' land is not an evil land. If we are thinking of the situation of different nations around, we should really think of neighbors, of neighboring countries, neighboring tribes or nations, not about enemies and nations we should fight against. In this context, his intellectual culture, and I think intellectual culture of Kraków Academy at that time, was to rather to attract them, of course, to Christian religion. That's obviously was the goal. But to attract, not to conquer, not to fight with them. And perhaps this element is the main thing we should say about Paweł Włodkowic's heritage, legacy.
Okay. Thank you very much. And please, Sister Professor.
I'll try to make 2 points. Intellectual culture regarding war and the whole question of colonialism. I would say on one level, there's the whole point of, which was back to the question you asked before, that
yes.
no war and no colonialism. Yet, I think we would be naive to think that we will not have these continuing. And as Professor Knoll mentioned, throughout history, we've had something of this. We rationalize, we use theological debates like the Teutonics did to argue, to defend what we're doing. But again, it's a very broad, difficult question, also because of all the history that we've lived through. And different countries have lived that history in different ways, whether they've been the empire or the colony, or sometimes the mixture. And I'll say that coming from the United States. Yes. And let me just make a reference here, because here I'll speak from the United States, just the challenge. Today we have cancel culture, which wants to eliminate any history of the colonialism. And yet, in the midst of that, you end up with a reverse prejudice, with other injustices that come forward. So, as I say, it's a very complex issue because of our history, also because of the different cultures. And I think for that reason, we do need to have this discussion, which is why Paweł is relevant, because sinfulness exists. There will be issues, whether they take the name of colonialism or not. Thank you.
So thank you very much. And now I would like to ask if there are any more questions, further questions from our audience. If you want to make some further remarks, please just do it by raising your hand. And if there are not further, you have a question, so please.
Thank you very much for this wonderful discussion. I have two quick questions about Paweł Włodkowic. The first is, can some of you professors please specify what was his contribution in the Council of Constance, and what there was of relevance for the geopolitical situation at the time? This is one question. And the second question would be this. Are there situations, discussions, I mean, something equivalent to the dialogues in Valladolid, West or Eastern Europe, whatever, are there situations in which the thought of Paweł was relevant? I mean, where during those discussions, whatever they were, because I'm totally ignorant of that, Włodkowic was an instrument towards some kind of solution. So thank you very much.
So, probably Professor Knoll, you would like to answer the first question, I think.
Yeah, let me just say very briefly that with respect to the efforts of Paweł Włodkowic at Constance, at the very least he wished to see the political policies of his king successful vis-a-vis the Teutonic Knights in terms of establishing not just simply a resolution over contested issues, but also a turning back of the clock to pre-existing positions. There had been a time when, for example, in the 14th century, papal courts had been established, first in 1320-21, again in 1339, to address charges made by the Polish rulers at the time against the Teutonic Knights, and that the papal courts had found in Poland's favor. The Teutonic Knights had simply ignored those as being non-relevant, and they were indifferent to them. And Paweł was particularly interested in ensuring that the outcome of those papal judgments made in the 14th century be incorporated into the ultimate resolution between between Poland, Lithuania, and the Teutonic Knights. If it couldn't be accomplished at the Council of Constance, then it was nevertheless continued to be pursued. And those of you who have had a chance to read some of the documents that were written after the Council of Constance that are contained in the collection of the writings will note that there are references to these papal courts of 1321, 1320, and 1339. And then very quickly to the last comment that you raised, the reality is that Paweł Włodkowic's works were not referred to and not utilized and not discussed in subsequent consideration over these issues as one proceeds down through the generations after the 15th century. And that in it itself is a question as why not? And that requires a much more complicated analysis than I can give because it's beyond my ken, and perhaps an analysis that maybe nobody can give. It's a really difficult issue.
So thank you very much, and I think that we don't have further questions. Yes, I think so. So please, Father Cezary, if you can end this part of our conference.
Thank you for this part of the conference, and please allow me to invite you for a 15 minutes coffee break. So we meet in 15 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It was a really great lecture. Thank you very much.
Welcome to the second part of the conference today. I would like to now introduce Professor Marek Cichocki, the initiator of our conference, professor at the College of Europe in Natolin, co-founder of Political Theology, He received his doctorate and habilitation in philosophy from the Polish Academy of Sciences in Poland. He was program director of the Center of International Relations in Warsaw. He is the author of award-winning books such as Hijacking Europe and North and South, texts on Polish culture and history. Professor Cichocki will give a lecture entitled Paweł Włodkowic, Key Political Ideas and Contemporary Modern Politics. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this conference, which is the final act of the project we have. Today I would like to talk to you more on present than on the past. And my intention is to share with you some remarks, some reflections and observations related to the legacy of Paweł Włodkowic's thought in the context of the current international politics. I would like to make this introductory remarks to our discussion about the current value of Włodkowic's political thought and his writings to us today. Włodkowic had his specific historical context of medieval Europe, which was comprehensively and widely discussed in the previous discussion. And so have we now. We have also our specific context we live in, a contemporary context of European and global events and affairs. Hence, let me start with a rather general remark about our current historiosophical position. I have this privilege not to be the historian, but rather the philosopher. So I would like to propose a historiosophical explanation or illustration of our current position. And then, of course, I would like to come to the legacy of Włodkowic in this context. And I think that this, our context, contemporary context, should be viewed in a certain process. First, 20th century marked new times of growing deviation from the previously dominating logic, modern logic of Westphalian international politics. I mean here not Westphalian system, which is history of modern international politics, framed the interstates relations in 17th and 18th century, but something much broader in a sense, a logic of jus publicum Europaeum. It implied that politics is between states, and international politics is basically divided in times of war and times of peace. The wars are waged in order to achieve advantageous peace conditions, enshrined in the new peace treaty. Thus, there was kind of rationality behind this logic, sometimes a miscalculation logic, or at least a belief that such rationality will prevail in the end of each conflict. And I think this logic ended ultimately with the outcome of the World War II and the subsequent Cold War. George Orwell, seeking for the appropriate description of the new situation which occurred with the atomic bomb and the Cold War, decided to apply an intriguing term to it, namely that now people live in times when there is a peace which is not peace. In short, it meant that the old division between times of peace and times of war has gone forever, replaced now by the state of permanent war or wars, which, however, occur in the frame of the Cold War peace, a systemic peace constituted by two world powers, the US and Soviet Russia. But, secondly, with the end of the Cold War, this situation has passed and we entered new kind of times, I would say heliastic times. These times were of transformative peace, which should be, we were assured, lead humanity into an entirely new post-historical and post-political epoch, to the outset of a kind of Weltinnenpolitik, as Jürgen Habermas called it, a moment of the liberal arc of history, as Barack Obama stated later, or simply the end of history, as conceptually described by Francis Fukuyama in his famous book. Now, and this is my third, as many international events may signal to us, in Ukraine, Middle East, Africa, or Asia, we are just entering again completely new times, which by looking for appropriate historical illustration, so I mean here more allegory than straight historical analogy, I would call a new Hellenistic times, which, with reference to the example of the ancient Hellenistic globalization with aggressive empires occurring and subsequently falling in chaotic course of historical events. So, more intensity in conflicts and less historical sense. That is what we can observe now. And exactly this kind of chaotic state of affairs, caused by powers as general development of our new times we live in, strengthened, of course, by technological revolutions, is extremely worrying, as it means in practice of international politics a strong preponderance of egoism, pure force, aggression, cynicism, and cruelty. It means the global world ruled by empires which can do with peoples what they want to do. I'm saying about all of this primarily because I think it gives the necessary context which enable us to understand what is the genuine value and significance of Paweł Włodkowic's political thought for our contemporary situation. His thought has its own historical context of the turn of 13th and 15th centuries, of the war between the Polish crown and the Teutonic Order, and of the impact made by the Council of Constance on the international affairs in late medieval Europe. But I believe that from that historical context and from specific content of Włodkowic's political and legal thought, there is a universal lesson we can still draw from in our new, let's say, Hellenistic times. Włodkowic is best known as the opponent of the aggressive religious wars, and I think that we will, for sure, in our discussion, after this introductory remarks, discuss comprehensively the question of religious freedom. However, let me draw your attention on three other important concepts of Włodkowic, which constitute his general understanding of the principles of international politics. First, the concept of just and unjust wars. Secondly, the concept of jus gentium, general law of nations or peoples. And finally, his understanding of the essence of the political sovereignty. All three concepts are worth to be noted in the current context of violent new Hellenistic times, in my opinion. It is no surprise that with the war in Ukraine and then war in Middle East, we are nowadays anew confronted with the basic problem of the just and unjust wars. For Włodkowic, was it completely clear that we have to keep this distinction if we don't want to fall in a kind of morally dangerous political relativism? Following St. Augustine, Włodkowic believed that we as mortals are not in position to transform the world, which has own painful and sinful logic. However, we are morally obliged by natural and divine law to try to constrain the evil by imposing certain rules, open politics and conflicts. If we resign of defending the principles of just and unjust wars, we in effect are dependent on one simple alternative: noble but in effect misleading pacifism, or the bloody slaughter of nations. To escape this alternative, we need to claim adhering certain rules of jus ad bellum, jus in bello, and jus post bellum. Among them, perhaps the most important idea here is the right cause and the right to self-defense. Aggressive wars, wars of conquest and of annexation, without any attempt to look for new peace conditions, imperial wars have to be principally condemned as violating the natural order, which should be respected as the foundation for human, individual, and collective relationships. Only then we can try influence and moderate slightly the inherent and irreversible dramatic nature of political human world. And I think this is the question which we today are confronted again. Second idea, which constituted Włodkowic's political thought, was the medieval concept of jus gentium, the law of the peoples. It was fundamental to his understanding of the nature of politics and relations between the nations. And today it regains its disturbing, even alarming significance in face of evolving international politics. Let me remind you, in 1995, in his address to the United Nations General Assembly, John Paul II, by reflecting on the issue of human rights and nation rights, has made a direct and strong reference to, in his speech, to Paweł Włodkowic's political writings and other authors who together represented a common way of political and legal thinking at a medieval university in Krakow, which later some historians, like Ludwig Ehrlich, identified as a unique medieval Polish school of international affairs. In his speech, the Pope stressed the meaning of Włodkowic's concept of the people, of the people's and collective human life, which, like the individual life has to be perceived as real, concrete reflection of the universal and inalienable human rights entered in the nature of the human person, in which we find the image of common universal moral principles. These principles tell us about the dignity of each human real life and each social and political collectivity. They let us recognize our human reality as not irrational or without any sense, nor deprived completely of any moral logic. In politics, domestic or international, these principles facilitates to transform the situation of coercion into the situation of persuasion. It is worth to be noted that Pope's reflections on Włodkowic are made in a context of epochal change which occurred in Europe and worldwide in the aftermath of the end of the Cold War, and great hopes raised for a new era of freedom. As John Paul II stated in his speech, I quote him, "At the threshold of the new millennium, we are witnessing an extraordinary and global acceleration of the quest for freedom, which represents one of the main driving forces of human history. This phenomenon is not limited to just one part of the world, nor is it an expression of just one culture. On the contrary, people in every corner of the earth, despite the threat of violence, have taken the risk of seeking freedom, demanding a place in social, political, and economic life that reflects their dignity as free individuals. This pursuit of freedom is truly one of the defining features of our era." Let me add to these words today that I doubt truly whether today we could repeat those words of the Pope with the same confidence as in 1995. This is so because we are nowadays witnessing international political realities in the world where the idea of the right of nations, the peoples, the right to life, to develop freely and peacefully, to prosper due to own efforts, is being violated more and more often and openly in theory, in action, as a consequence of the growing struggle of powers. Those powers, at least some of them, seems to believe having almighty right to decide whether some nations can continue to exist or they have to perish. In principle, the collective human life, as well as individual, is being measured differently and accordingly to the wishes and purposes of those who are powerful. Accordingly, there is more valuable life and less valuable life. And in some cases, it has no meaning at all. The third issue that determined Włodkowic's political thought was his understanding of how to secure the foundations of independence of political entity. Włodkowic belongs to proponents of the conciliarism movement in late medieval Europe, whose ideas strongly influenced views on the church, but also on politicals itself. In fact, this approach to ecclesiastical and political community gave in Polish political tradition and practices a very strong tendency of opting for collective and egalitarian decision-making within the political entity as the genuine foundation of political unity and autonomy, and growing criticism against centralization and institutionalization. Certainly, Włodkowic was one of the chief political and legal thinkers responsible for the principal rejection by Poles in 15th and 16th century of later modern Machiavellian approach to politics and the subsequent identification of the state politics with raison d'etat and absolutistic concept of state sovereignty. But again, if we transfer this understanding of collective political community as a body of citizens by Włodkowic into our contemporary political realities, I think we can immediately see some obvious conclusions. Observing 3 last decades of evolving politics in Europe and in the West, what strikes me the strongest is the gradually and consistent disappearing in our societies and in politics of the citizens' values, roles, and responsibilities. Less and less people are treated and even perceive themselves as citizens. We are even not sure anymore what it really means to be a citizen. And instead, we give ourselves up to the destructive logic of the stupidest polarization. I have no doubt that in current political disputes in Europe, Włodkowic would be possibly identified as an even populist or as a far right because of his focus on political entity as a body constructed by free and engaged citizens. But for sure, Włodkowic's understanding of what constitutes autonomy and agency of political entity goes completely against dominating now in Europe tendencies of technocratic centralization of power and top-down approach, which results from the increasing belief of the elites that there is acute necessity of concentrating all resources and capabilities in their hands in face of global and local crises and struggle between the powers like US and China. So these are 3 lessons, I think, we can still draw from his writings, Just and Unjust Wars, Law of Nations, and, let's say, Republican or conciliarist concept of political entity, which I would like to propose to be drawn from Włodkowic's ideas as his direct legacy to our times. Times which I read as stated above as new, possibly new Hellenistic times with more intensive conflicts and wars and less historical sense. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor, for your very interesting lecture. I would like now to introduce to you Michał Kłosowski, who will be moderating the panel discussion that is ahead of us. Mr. Kłosowski is a journalist and Vatican specialist, director of the Analysis and Development Department of the Institute of New Media and editor of the Polish Wszystko, co najważniejsze magazine. He is a graduate of the GP2 studies at the Angelicum and is currently preparing his doctorate dissertation at the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross. Michał, please take the floor.
Thank you very much, Father, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second part of our conference, on religious freedom, just war and sovereignty of nations, learning from Paweł Włodkowic. We've just heard an amazing introductory lecture by Professor Marek Cichocki, and I hope that it will be, a base ground for our discussion. In this session, we will explore how Paweł Włodkowic's ideas have evolved over time and what is their relevance in the contemporary world. Let me introduce our guests of this panel. I would like to welcome Professor John Lord Alderdice, who is a senior research fellow at Oxford University and a leading figure in the field of conflict resolution and peace building. His experience includes significant contributions to the Northern Ireland peace process and interfaith dialogue around the world. Please join us. It's my greatest pleasure to have among us Professor George Weigel. He's obviously a well-known expert of John Paul II pontificate and author of the famous biography of the Polish Pope. He's also a renowned Catholic theologian, distinguished senior fellow of the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C. And thank you very much, Professor. You are with us. My name is Michał Kosowski, and I will serve as a moderator, and I'm super happy to be here with us, with you, and it's a great honor to be here also as a graduate of JP2 studies. Because today in the Catholic Church, today is a special day in Catholic Church, obviously, because it's a day in which we remember John Paul II, our great saint. So let me start with Professor George Weigel. It's an honor to have you with us today. I would like to ask you, Professor, we've heard some remarks about that by Professor Cichocki, but I would like to ask you, do you see any kind of influence on John Paul II thought by the author of this conference, the historical author of the conference, Paweł Włodkowic?
Thank you, Michał. It's great to be here with everyone, and I want to thank the Institute here for hosting this and for hosting my teaching, which Michał somehow has survived and graduated successfully. That extraordinary lecture by Professor Cichocki stole a bit of my thunder, but let me begin by saying that when that UN speech was being developed in the spring and summer of 1995, it was John Paul II who personally insisted on inserting that section, beginning with citing the work of Paweł Włodkowic at the Council of Constance, into the text. That was his personal direct insertion into the text. But another aspect of that, I think, touches on however we want to trace the line between Paweł Włodkowic and Karol Wojtyła, and that is the notion that the natural moral law provides a kind of grammar by which, as was quoted, coercion can be replaced by persuasion in international public life. Let me just read you paragraph 3 of that 1995 address, which I think has a great Włodkowician echo. Pope has been talking about, as Marek said, this great movement of freedom. He says it is important for us to grasp what might be called the inner structure of this worldwide movement. It is precisely its global character which offers us its first and fundamental key and confirms that there are indeed universal human rights rooted in the nature of the person, rights which reflect the objective and inviolable demands of a universal moral law. These are not abstract points. Rather, these rights tell us something about the actual life of every individual and every social group. They also remind us that we do not live in an irrational or meaningless world. On the contrary, there is a moral logic which is built into human life and which makes possible dialogue between individuals and peoples. And then, to go back to the passage quoted earlier, if we want a century of violent coercion to be succeeded by a century of persuasion, we must find a way to discuss the human future intelligibly. The universal moral law written on the human heart is precisely that kind of grammar that is needed if the world is to engage this discussion of its future. Now, I hear echoes from Paweł Włodkowic in that.
Thank you very much, Professor Weigel. I would like now ask Lord Alderdich, using your experience on peace-building process, because Włodkowic was a vocal critic of the policy of Teutonic Knights, challenging the legitimacy of war as a tool for evangelization. I was wondering, how does his critique relate to the modern concept of just war, especially in the context of today's global conflicts, which are both, I would say, internal and external?
Well, thank you very much, first of all, to the colleagues here at JP2 Institute. It's marvelous to be back again here at Angelicum and to meet with colleagues previous and new. And this has been a very interesting and nourishing couple of days for me. I hadn't known of Paweł Włodkowic's work before I was asked to come and was provided with a copy of this marvelous book that Paul Knoll and his colleagues put together. And I found it absolutely fascinating and extremely relevant. There are a number of aspects of this. The first is, I suppose, that on this question of religious freedom and the requirement to acknowledge that there are those who will differ from you, they may differ from you within Christendom or inside and outside Christendom, but you must treat them with respect. You don't have to agree, but you must treat them with respect. And you must understand that they and you fall under natural law, and you must respect that. Now, this was a very important rubric for us in Ireland, North and South, and with Britain, because there were those on both sides who felt that they were wholly justified and that those on the other side were not, and they could be ignored or treated not really fully as human beings, as individuals or as a community. This was historically the case, and of course it led to complete tragedy. And so one of the things that emerged from our conversations was that there were 2 or 3 principles that we had to learn and then observe. One was that in such situations there was always a community, or more than one, that felt humiliated and disrespected. There was always a community, or more than one, that felt they were not being treated fairly. And attempts at a more peaceful negotiation, persuasion, as George has reminded us, had not worked to bring about a better outcome. And at the time that we were working, the general zeitgeist globally was increasingly that people were leaders if they resolve conflicts, whether it was Clinton or Gorbachev or Mandela or de Klerk or whatever. That was the zeitgeist. And even people on the street would stop us in Belfast and say, look, if they can start to do this in South Africa or in the Middle East, because the Oslo process was ongoing at that time, we have to be able to do it here. The zeitgeist now is quite different. Leaders believe themselves to be leaders because they are conducting conflict, not because they are resolving it. And it's a very dangerous place for us to be. And one of the problems about it is that I think the kind of rule, in a sense, the kind of way of thinking and behaving that Paweł identified, that everyone falls under the law of God, even the emperor, even His Holiness the Pope. There are certain things that the Pope is not entitled to do. There are certain things that go beyond even his position and power. And I think one of the great difficulties we've had over the last number of years is certain powers believing that they are exceptions, that they do not have to live by the same laws as other people. It's said that Napoleon declared, laws are made for ordinary men, but I'm no ordinary man. And I think there are some of our nations and states around the world that believe that international law is for others to obey, but not for them. And this is disastrous, because the consequence is that it brings the whole notion of international law into disarray and disrepute. And for this to happen at a time when technology, as was pointed out just a few minutes ago, has taken us not just to nuclear weapons and hypersonic weapons with nuclear payloads, but potentially with the decisions about firing them being taken by artificial intelligence, it is absolutely terrifying what may be there. And without some kind of moral compass, the danger is that humanity's days may be numbered, not just the times that we are in.
Thank you very much. We've opened so many fields and topics on those during those two speeches. But I'm super happy to hear that you mentioned zeitgeist, because I would like to ask you, Professor, Włodkowic argued strongly during his times for national sovereignty and self-determination, particularly in our part of the continent, in Central Europe. So I would like to ask you, how do his ideas resonate now with contemporary challenges, especially in Europe, where we see kind of like a tension between national identity and globalization?
Maybe, if I can, I would like to make first one reference to what you have asked before, namely this criticism of Teutonic order. This is a very important one still, I think, part of our Polish history and our historical identity, this struggle with Teutonic order. It's interesting, but it had the foundations, I mean, this conflict, surely, was one of the important foundations of our political and historical identity in Poland, and so far Włodkowic is within. Yes, he is a part of these foundations. But why this criticism? Because it was, I think, surely it was because of interests of the Polish crown, and it was about the geopolitical situation, especially after the victory of Władysław Jagiełło, and how to, let's say, consummate this victory politically, and so on and so forth. So very complex situation, but I think this criticism has also one very interesting, to me at least, in my interpretation, a very interesting and universal message, namely, what was Teutonic order? It's interesting to pose this question because it was a very good organized, well-managed business, political business, pre-modern, non-state, but still political business. And this universal message of this critique is, to me, especially today, that we don't accept this kind of thinking which was behind this business of the Teutonic order, that war and conquest can be the best way to facilitate modernization. Yes, exactly. So the war cannot be accepted as a way of modernize relations through wars and conflicts, which is, frankly speaking, unfortunately, idea very well present, I am afraid, in different speculations and policies, also today. So I think it is important to stress this universal message of this criticism and to show you only that this conflict is not only a part of our Polish identity, very important, but it has also a very interesting and important, outstanding universal meaning. Now, your question about this self-determination, yes, surely. I think if you look at the history of the whole region, not only Poland, but the Central Eastern Europe, this concept of this self-determination of the peoples, which has to be expressed because of the confrontation with aggressive empires in this region, it is linked to the ideas of Włodkowic in a very clear and understandable way, and I think the Pope, in his address to UN Assembly, of course, he stressed this global, general importance, significance of the quest for freedom, but he could do it in that way just because he came from this situation of the Central and Eastern Europe, of nations which were deprived of having own political freedom by aggressive powers which acted in the way as we described before, being above, beyond any frame of the common natural rules, dictating the rules according to the struggle of pure political power.
Thank you very much, Professor, for this clarification as well. Also, I saw you all professors writing and noting during each one is speaking, so I suppose that we will have a great discussion. Professor Weigel, I would like to ask you a question about religious freedom today. How significant are Włodkowic's conceptions of religious freedom in addressing today's challenges, especially after what we've heard from Professor Cichocki and Lord Alderdic? Because, well, we see that many Catholics are concerning religious persecution worldwide.
Before I take that up, just to illustrate how alive the debate about the reality of the struggle with the Teutonic Order is, for those of you who are not immersed in the history of Central Europe, Poland had a great ski jumper named Adam Małysz, was that the name? Wonderful. And there was a European ski jumping championship in Germany. And Poles were there holding up signs that said, Grunwald 1410, Małysz 2010. Deep history, as we call it. Paweł Włodkowic did not live at the time of the modern state, but I think his thinking about religious freedom has real implications for the present, because the modern state, or in some cases the postmodern state, seems to have a built-in tendency to reduce all other social institutions to its vassals. The modern state tends to try to fill up all of the social space, all of the space in society. So to assert and defend and live the right of religious freedom is to make a statement about the limits of the state. There is territory that the state cannot legitimately occupy. In personal terms, that's the sanctuary of conscience that the Second Vatican Council talked about. And in public terms, that's the question of the rights of religious communities to organize their own lives and ministries according to their own self-understanding. We might have thought that that body of thought had been secured 25 or 30 years ago, but as you correctly indicated, were that speech to be given at the UN today, it would be given in a different key, I think. It seems to me that the principal example of the problem of the modern state trying to reduce other institutions to its vassals comes to us today in the form of Mr. Xi Jinping's attempt to sinicize all religion in China, a phenomenon I wrote about in the Wall Street Journal last Friday. This is to reduce all religious communities, Catholic, Protestant, house churches, whatever, to instruments, although here's the difference, not so much of the state, but of the Chinese Communist Party. This has now taken the form where in Catholic churches in China, pictures of the Lord, images of the Lord and Our Lady, are being replaced by images of Mr. Xi Jinping. Priests are being taken from Hong Kong for education in sinicization in Beijing. This is a real problem, and Włodkowic's concept of religious freedom clearly has relevance to dealing with that. I think the other thing that has relevance, not so much in an immediate practical sense, but in terms of the history of rights talk in the world, is that those interventions at the Council of Constance make it very clear that religious freedom and other basic human rights were not inventions of the Continental Enlightenment. See, this is the mythology that dominates high culture throughout the Western world to today. All of that good stuff came out of the Continental Enlightenment. Well, no, actually it has much deeper roots. And while Włodkowic, I don't think, made reference to this, I would say the deepest roots in Western civilization of our concept of religious freedom as creating free space for individuals and religious communities comes from the gospel. I mean, when the Lord says, give to Caesar what's Caesar's and give to God what's God's, That means that there are things of God's that are not Caesar's, which means that Caesar's power is limited, which means when Caesar tries to totalize his power, he's stepping out of bounds. Now, the line between that and the Council of Constance and Dignitatis Humanae at Vatican II in 1965 is obviously a very complex one, but it's simply historically fatuous to say that the Western world never thought about religious freedom before Voltaire. And if we don't get that out of our heads, as Enlightenment rationalism crumbles around us into various postmodern nuttinesses, if I may say, then the whole structure of rights language, rights ideas, etc., is going to crumble with it.
Thank you very much, Professor Weigel. I would like to refer to what you've said during your first intervention about the leaders who are not trying to build peace, but to maintain or start some conflicts. Because I would like to, again, use a little bit of your experience from the peace building process. Also, Włodkowic was a pioneer of religious dialogue in this kind of, in this sense. How can his approach to religious tolerance be, I don't know, used somehow in modern peace process?
I think the first thing to say is that you accepted that people had very different perspectives. And he said, what is extremely important is that we accept and understand that, and there are things we won't agree about. There are many things we can agree about, but there's some things we won't agree about. And therefore we have to find a way of living together with our differences. In talking about peace processes, sometimes people will say to me, well, isn't it marvelous that almost 30 years ago now, you got an agreement in Ireland, North and South? And I said, well, yes, but you need to understand what the agreement was. The agreement was to disagree without killing each other. It wasn't that everybody agreed either about the past or about the future. But it was an agreement that we had to find a better way of disagreeing that did not involve violence. That was a very strong liberal principle for a long time. But my own observation as somebody who comes from that tradition is that people have become increasingly intolerant of those who take a different view. And for me, that's a betrayal, really, of the whole tradition that accepts that there will be difference. In a kind of sense, one almost needs to treat secularism as a kind of religion of its own, which then comes into conflict with more traditional religious families and faith families. So what does this mean for peace processes? Well, it seems to me what it means is that one has got to go into them, first of all, with a degree of humility. That we cannot get engaged in these things with the feeling that we know the answers to all of these things. The second thing is that fundamentally, the problems are not just about disagreements on ideas or on structures. They're about disturbed historic relationships which we need to find ways to repair. It's that relationship quality that's crucial, because we won't agree on some of the content, but it doesn't mean we can't engage in respectful relationships and fair conduct with each other. And it seems to me that this is what he was striving to say very clearly. He got, as Poles sometimes do, quite determined and passionate about it when you read the way he puts it. But he was respectful, and he was also clear about where there were deep disagreements. But he wanted to find a way that the rule of law and better relationships could lead to a non-violent way of communities living together. And the thing about national sovereignty, I think, is because it's kind of like respect for individuals at a higher level, that communities will have different perspectives. And one of the problems that has emerged in recent times is whether because of great powers or whether because of elites pulling together nation states, there has been less acceptance and respect for the position that individual cultures take and to say, well, yes, that's different from ours, and that's fine, and we just need to find a way where we can, and that's really what peace processes are about. They're not about people signing up for all the same things. They're finding structures and relationships that enable them to live together with their disagreements. And of course, that's at local level, it's at regional level, and it's now seriously at global level. There will be no coming together of understandings between, for example, China and the United States and even Europe. But we still have to find a way of living together, because if we don't, we will die together.
Thank you very much for this very strong point. Professor Cichocki, I would like to ask you, because to be honest, I was super intrigued when I've heard that you said that Włodkowic would be named as a far-right person or populist today, especially probably in the European Union. So I was wondering, to what extent can Włodkowic's concept of sovereignty inform contemporary debates within the European Union? How can it be used by those who are debating within the EU?
Of course, it was just my hypothesis, because I don't know whether it would be true, but I can imagine that it could happen, that he, with his concept of what is the real foundation of the political entity, could be today perceived as a proponent of this concept of popular sovereignty and this clash between ordinary people and elites and so on and so forth. I think that despite of that, it is worth to come back to his way of how he understood political entity, because this way shows that we should learn again to set certain limits to this quest for centralized power within the political entity, this quest for effectiveness at the expense of inclusiveness, and so on and so forth. And that is why I have nothing against European integration or against European Union, provided that we understand that this is the mechanism which is constituted on the one hand on this ability to create new levels of cooperation, let's say supranational, and then institutionalize it. But on the other hand, we have to protect what is the core of our political agency as citizens, and the state, democracy, our responsibility for politics as citizens within the states. This is what constitutes our political agency. And that is why I am so really surprised, because, you know, I come from the generation that benefited a lot of the end of the Cold War. And I was exactly of this generation which could hear the words of John Paul II to the General Assembly in the United States with applause and enthusiasm, because it was also about me. And about many people in my age in Poland and in Central Eastern Europe. And I am really worried about how certain things are disappearing from from European politics. No one is talking now about the democratic deficit, which was a topic, the major topic of all discussions in Europe in the 90s, for example. Everyone was talking about the problem of the democratic deficit in Europe, and that this is a serious, severe problem we have to take seriously, and we try to give appropriate answers to this. No one is talking about citizenship and the responsibility of each us as citizens. And I remember in 90s that was one of the major problems to the debate. What does it mean, citizens? How citizens are important for our democracies? Now, citizens are replaced by something different.
Consumers.
Or recipients, even, yes, as clients, yes. We have to cover their needs and so on and so forth, but we don't give them the voice and we don't give them responsibility. Why? Because we are looking for effectiveness. Why? Because we are in a completely new geopolitical situation and Europe has to be fit for a new struggle of powers, and so on and so forth. So we are now in a logic which is completely different and pushing us in a different direction. And I think Włodkowic is helpful because it reminds us about the fundamentals, which for me, also from the generational reasons, are very important.
Well, speaking about citizenship being a citizen right now, well, Catholics are also citizens, and we are just days before the US elections. So I would like to ask you, Professor Weigel, kind of like a tricky question maybe, because Catholics are also voting to protect their own rights, to be able to worship, to pray, etc., etc. How do you think Włodkowic's thought can guide the Church as Catholics in asserting this right to be a Catholic, to pray, in a world that kind of increasingly challenges religious values?
That wasn't on the list of questions. Actually, I am less worried about religious freedom in the United States over the next 4 years than about a number of other things. We have a Supreme Court that has created a jurisprudence of religious freedom over the past 15 years that is much more protective of the rights of individuals and of religious communities than had been the case from 1948 till maybe the late 1990s or the early parts of the new century. What does deeply concern me, and this is not a problem that can be remedied quickly, is that when, for example, the Vice President in her campaigning says, this constant mantra, there is so much more that unites us than divides us. Well, that's true at one level. I mean, this tremendous response of people all over the eastern United States to this terrific damage that the hurricane did in North Carolina was very, very impressive. On the other hand, we are deeply divided on some fundamental questions. And it is the question of human nature and the human person. And the divide seems to be about 50-50. There is the richly textured, biblically informed, I think philosophically coherent view of the human person that has come to us throughout the Western civilizational tradition. And then there is this notion that we are all simply little bundles of desires that the satisfaction of those desires exhausts the meaning of human rights, that it's the job of the state to facilitate the satisfaction of those desires, and all those desires are commensurable morally unless somebody else gets hurt, except if the somebody else getting hurt is an unborn child or increasingly a terminally ill adult. This is a fundamental divide that has to be addressed. One would have thought that the sum total of human misery that had been caused by this libertine notion of personhood would have caused people to think again, but it seems not to have done so. The Democratic Party at its convention in August essentially turned abortion into a civic sacrament. I mean, something's deeply awry when that happens. On the other side, you have a figure for whom everything is transactional. Everything is transactional, which means there's no moral guidelines, guardrails to determine public policy. What works, according to his definition of what works, is what gets done. So my pre-election column next week is entitled "Hard Times Coming," no matter who wins. And finally, I would add, this is not good news to give to all of you here, and those of you who know my writing know that I've probably written more articles in defense of Ukraine than anybody in the United States over the last 2.5 years. But the lack of interest in this campaign, in international affairs, is staggering, absolutely staggering. People are not demanding that the vice president, the former president, address these things seriously. And that's, again, I think, a fault in the demos here. I mean, John Paul II was very clear in Centesimus Annus. It takes a certain kind of people living certain virtues to make democracy and the market work so that they serve the ends of human flourishing and social solidarity. And that's, I think, the deficit we've got right now, is a political culture deficit that is going to take a considerable amount of time to reverse. But I'm not that worried about religious freedom because I think the legal architecture is in place for the foreseeable future to handle that, although we're going to have a lot of battles on our hands.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Lord Adler-Dieter, I would like to ask you a quite simple question, I would say. Do you think that Włodkowic approach, ethical approach to war and to kind of peace building and maybe not avoiding conflicts but resolving conflicts can give us as a Catholic citizens kind of like a new framework for modern time, for modern conflicts?
One is always somewhat cautious when a journalist says, "I've got a very simple question for you." But it's a very important question. The first thing I would say about it is to pick up the question of whether he would be judged a populist or not nowadays. And I understand why you say that from some perspectives. But I think, for example, if one looks at how strenuously, I would almost say courageously, he champions the rights of what in those days would have been called pagans, but people who had a very, very different religious perspective, shows a concern about the others who are different, which I think is not something that characterizes populism. I think the second thing is that he, of course, was a lawyer, but it seems to me he was not a lawyer who simply wanted the rule of law. He wanted a culture of lawfulness, which is not exactly the same thing. It goes one further in a sense. Again, I don't sense that that's something that you find with most populist leaders. they want the law to serve their purpose rather than to be prepared to live under the law with the restrictions and boundaries that sets on our behavior. And I think in that sense, to come more directly to your question, he does have really, really important things to say to us at the moment. Because the whole culture of international law is dissolving in front of our eyes. And if that continues, as at present, then we are in increasing difficulties. I think the second thing is that I detect in him a concern for relationships within the community. And he had, for example, the relationship between Poland and Lithuania, which was one that had to be, there was a real bringing together. People had different backgrounds and cultures. And he said, I want that. I don't want somebody coming in or a group coming in, the Teutonic Knights, and just imposing things. People's beliefs should not be something that are imposed on them. Persuasion, that's a completely different thing, but coercion, that is not an acceptable thing. Those kinds of principles, it seemed to me, are extremely important. And when we look at some parts of the world, and you've mentioned Xi Jinping, the notion of coercion in terms of beliefs is just writ large. And we could look around various countries and parts of the world and see them setting aside fundamental principles that Włodkowic was strong with. Of course, we live in a different context. Of course, things are different. One of the things that's different, for example, is when we come to look at the question of a just war. In those days, the question was, could the politician and or political leader or general live by a moral code? It's different now because at every level we want people to live by a moral code. The ordinary soldier, as we saw, for example, in some of the results of what happened in Iraq and so on, if they don't understand a moral code, we are in all sorts of difficulties. And there's been quite a lot of writing about that in the last little while, trying to look at the question of morality in the context of war. David Fisher wrote a wonderful book in 2011 about precisely these issues. So I think there's much guidance to be taken from him, as long as we appreciate that, of course, he was living at a different time and in a different context. But the principles that he sets down are, it seems to me, just as important for us now, if we can interpret them aright.
Thank you very much. Last, like the previous panel, we've ended with mentioning cancel culture. And I think that's another topic we should discuss in this panel. Professor Cichocki, I would like to ask you another simple question. In the context of today's Europe, where the national sovereignty is often at odds with liberal policies and globalists, how can the understanding of Włodkowic, the Włodkowic understanding of religious freedom can support also us Catholics and Catholic nations in kind of defending the identity and moral values we believe in?
I think certainly what we are witnessing now in Europe is a growing clash between, let's say, certain international or supranational approach of some institutions we have created, by the way, and then national member states, and I think that this will be rather increasing phenomenon. So and probably this is the point which will even decide about the future of the whole project, to what extent European Union will be capable of absorbing these tensions. If not, then I would rather be afraid that it will fall apart, and the example of Brexit serves to show a certain model how it can happen. Yes. But I think what is inspired by what George said, I think much more problematic or dangerous is what we really can observe. You mentioned to woke. I mean that we lose the common understanding of what is human life and what is human being. And Włodkowic was, in that sense, in a much more better situation than we are, because he acted in a frame which was a Christian one, and of course there was a struggle between this imperial quest and natural law and divine law and so on, papacy on the one hand and empire on the other hand, and the different crowns. But still in the frame of the common understanding what is human life, at least in theory, if not in action, of course. But in theory, yes, and we have a much more difficult and worrying situation, I think, because we are losing the common understanding. And this is exactly what George said, and this is because, on the one hand, because the globalization led to the confrontation of different traditions, let's say, and it is obvious that in China the understanding of human life and human person is completely different. That this which comes from our Christian tradition. So globalization contributed vastly to this kind of complexity we have to face somehow. And we can observe, for example, in United Nations, how this universal concept, for example, of individual rights is evolving sometimes in a very strange direction. Sometimes, at least from the perspective of the Christian tradition. But even in Europe, and this is something which is relevant for I think for us as a huge threat, as a huge challenge. We are losing the common sense of what the human life is, and this is not the problem that I believe in God and you don't believe in God, and we have to keep tolerance and so on and so forth. Because the consequences is much more severe, much more concrete of that. If we cannot agree on this fundamental issue. So I think in respect to this, Włodkowic was in a better position, situation that we are now.
Thank you very much. As we do have 15 minutes, because we need to finish our conference at 6, please, if any of you do have any questions, remarks, comments, be prepared to ask them. And let me ask the final question right now. Professor Weigel, I would like to, well, to be honest, I would like to ask 3 of you professors the same question. What's the most important part of Włodkowic's teaching about religious freedom and peace-building process we can apply today in our times? Professor Weigel, we'll start with you.
I'm going to decline to answer that and say that I want to follow up on something that Sister Catherine talked about in terms of just war, because this is really important. The main issue today, in terms of the just war tradition, is defending its very legitimacy against people who say there are no just wars. Now, this is a big problem in the Catholic Church today. This is a big problem in the Catholic Church today. But if you say there are no just wars, you create any number of problems. You create a pastoral problem. To say there are no just wars is to say that war is intrinsically evil, and that puts a tremendous burden of conscience on Catholics in the armed forces, which they should not be asked to bear. It's a big theological problem. If you are saying there is no such thing as a just war and a just war tradition, and that tradition is based on the principles of the natural moral law, which do not change, which we can know by reason, then you're saying de facto there is no natural moral law. And that's a huge problem. So I think that the Włodkowician defense of the very idea of a just war tradition where we can distinguish between just wars and unjust wars, we can distinguish just actions within war against unjust actions in war. This is a terribly important thing for the future, because if we don't defend this idea, the barbarians are going to take over. I mean, the people who like Putin, who has no more concept of just war than the man in the moon. You cannot leave the field to the murderers. That's simply irresponsible. And we need to lift that up. And in a sense, that is a defense of religious freedom, because so much of the just war tradition in the West has been informed by Catholic thought, Protestant thought, et cetera, et cetera. So I felt the need, as they say, to get that in.
So I assume that we'll have a comment from Sister Professor after that, or not really? No? Okay, that's fine. Well,
Two comments briefly. The first is to say that I agree that it is very important to maintain the concept of just war. The community I come from, I think, is less deeply divided than the one that you're describing, so it's less of a kind of front issue for me. What is the front issue for me is making sure that our countries abide by the principles of just war, and that's where the big gap is, it seems to me, from that point of view. The second comment is to directly answer your question. For me, and I emphasize it's for me, given my background and so on, it is his setting out and standing for the principle of tolerance, which is for me of profound significance. Tolerance, a preparedness to live with those with whom you deeply disagree and to protect their right, to protect their lives and their property and so on and so on. It's easy to say, it's very challenging to live with, but it seems to me, in terms of the contribution he made, it is for me one of the most important contributions he made. And I'm very glad that he's been brought back to our memory by this event. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Cichocki?
I think two things from Włodkowic. First, use Gentium, because it addresses directly the problem which I see, that we are entering the situation in which more and more we politics agrees that there are political entities, nations, which have the right to exist, and those who have less right to exist. Or then, following this logic, we come to the conclusion there are also those nations who don't have no right to exist, and this is very dangerous tendency I observe in the international politics, especially in the course of the last years. And secondly, just war. because it addressed another problem which occupies my attention, this quotation by George Orwell and his observation that we are living in times of peace without peace. And I think it is something which is more understandable, I think, for people with all respect, and excuse me for this remark, but I have to make it, that it is much more obvious for people coming from my part of Europe, that we are living all the time, since World War II, in times of peace without peace. Then many people thought living in the West under the illusion that the war is over, yes, and we can just only see some conflicts in a, let's say, new movie about James Bond or something like that. That something is happened under the surface, but principally, we are living now in peaceful times. And it was illusion. We live in peace without peace, and now we are coming again in this situation. And I think the question of the just wars and the just cause, that sometimes it is inevitable to enter the war. But what is the intention? What is the intention? Is the peace the intention, or rather the conquest is the real intention? I think this issue addresses very good the problem we are witnessing now.
Thank you very much. We still do have just a few minutes for questions. If there are any questions from the participants, any comments, any thoughts? Not really. It's almost 6.
In the Catholic Catechism signed by John Paul II, there are a couple of reasons to just war, and these reasons are very strict. You know? This reason to start the just war are very, very strict. So the first one is very, very serious evil, yeah? And the second one, no tools to repair this evil in different way. And the next reason is high probability to quick win. To quick win. And the last one is convenience that this war does not make a greater evil.
Right.
Do you think that in contemporary world, when with globalization of the business, with this huge deception, it is possible to find the truth for just war?
To find
this reason to just war, because deception is spread everywhere, yeah, and this globalization of the business. So can we really find the truth about this reason to just war?
Well, if the neighbor has declared that you are not a nation, he intends to destroy you, because you're not a nation, you don't have a culture, you don't have a real language, you're basically an appendix to us, and then he gets within 20 kilometers of your capital while killing people right and left on the way, yeah, you have a very justifiable reason to fight back. In fact, what Mr. Putin has done and is doing while we sit here is a classic illustration of the violation of just about every just war principle, ad bellum and in bello. I mean, the present Russian strategy is to destroy the energy infrastructure of Ukraine so that everybody's freezing this winter. This is not kosher at all. I will say, I think the catechism discussion of the just war tradition is one of the weaker sections in the Catechism. But what I'm really concerned about now is what I said a moment ago, and I think Sister Catherine hinted at. There is this idea that there is no such thing as a just war, and that is to deny the possibility of applying rational human judgment to these limit cases when people come after you the way Putin has come after Ukraine. Now, it is absolutely the case that new technologies are stretching those principles, the in bello principles particularly, but that just simply calls for more careful thought. Finally, I was glad Sister brought this up in her very fine presentation. I've been arguing since a book in 1987 that in addition to the jus in bello, war decision law, when is it legitimate to go to war, and jus in bello, what constitutes morally legitimate fighting, there is implicit in the just war theory, at least in the Catholic interpretation of it, a jus ad pacem, that this is to be done for the end of restoring or building peace. And I think Lord Allardyce came to that. I think that is very rarely brought into discussions of just war tradition, and it needs to be emphasized some more. This is not simply about gratuitous destruction. There is a moral end to this, and the end is not simply defense or recovery of something lost, but the establishment of as my colleague here said, the establishment of a framework in which we can disagree without killing each other.
Sister Professor, just...
I would just add to that again, hinted at but emphasizing the whole point, even with Pope Francis in terms of his comments on Ukraine. The point is that the state must defend its citizens. All of this is about what is the state, what is that obligation. So yes, you can argue based on that, but we have to keep in mind the peace, but also the obligation of the state to defend when they are attacked. What is the state? What is the authority of the state, and what is their obligation? And we have to keep that in mind. Thank you.
Well, and that is why, as Sister knows as far better than I do, Aquinas locates his discussion of just war in the treatise on charity. Mm-hmm. Because this is an obligation of the obligation of charity towards the neighbor.
Do we have any other questions? No. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, speakers, professors, and let's give them a round of applause.
Very good to meet you. Thank you.
Thank you to all of our speakers and guests for an interesting discussion this evening. It was a thrill to have you. Please stay tuned for the next conference and lecture of the St. John Paul II Institute of Culture, and have a good night. Thank you very much.
I'm going to run for a plane here, guys. Great to see you.
If you see David Alton in the house...
And welcome all of you to the reception at Sala Colone, here next door. So please, you are welcome.